The next item of business is Members' Business Debate on Motion 20261 in the name of Lewis MacDonald on Sustainable Development Goals in Scotland on target for 2030. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons. I now call on Lewis MacDonald to open the debate for around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to move this motion, and I am grateful to all those members who have signed it and to the many organisations which have come forward with briefings to support this debate, some of which are represented in the gallery today. The Sustainable Development Goals are global goals. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was agreed by the United Nations in 2015 as a plan of action for people, planet and prosperity. The agenda aspires to end poverty and hunger, to protect the planet from degradation, to ensure prosperous and fulfilling lives for all, and to foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies. Those are big ambitions. They require innumerable actions by very large numbers of actors, governments, intergovernment agencies, non-government organisations, businesses, trade unions, voluntary and community organisations, and individuals around the world. We can be proud of the actions taken by many from and in Scotland towards achieving those goals worldwide, whether through NGOs, through churches or faith communities, through secondment from work in our public services, or directly as volunteers or as part of government engagement with developing countries. Many thousands of people make a real and substantial contribution to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in some of the poorest countries on the planet. But the global goals apply here too. Scotland will be judged not just on the work Scots do or support elsewhere, we will be judged on how far we as a country measure up against those global goals. That is why today's debate is focused on the latest report from Scottish civil society on progress in Scotland towards achieving the UN's global goals. On Target for 2030 asks the question of how we are doing here, measured against the same standards as the rest of the world, and it produces some challenging answers. The question really matters, so we are indebted to Oxfam in partnership with the University of the West of Scotland and to the SDG Network Scotland for bringing this comprehensive assessment forward. And we are indebted to a total of 22 organisations in civil society for the informed and insightful contributions they have made. From the Health and Social Care Alliance to the Built Environment Forum, from the Child Poverty Action Group to the Marine Conservation Society, from Girl Guiding Scotland to the Scottish Trade Union Congress, from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to business in the community. These are all organisations working at the front line of the whole range of sustainable development issues right across Scotland. Scotland's International Development Alliance puts all of this in the context of Scotland's place in the wider world and emphasises that all of these goals must be addressed together, not separately. And it is a sobering assessment. When so many of our constituents rely on food banks to feed their families, members will not be surprised to learn from Nourish Scotland that 8% of the Scottish population describe themselves as food insecure. Perhaps less familiar is the finding of research by Citizens Advice Scotland that 12% of households in Scotland may struggle to afford their charges for water and sewerage. Or the projection from ChangeWorks that the current Scottish Government target means that in 2040, 5% of the Scottish population will still be in fuel poverty due to poor energy efficiency. A common thread among many of these analyses is the need to tackle inequality. Another is the need to do so with the participation of those affected by inequalities themselves. Oxfam quote figures from the Office of National Statistics confirming that the wealth held by the top 10% of households is around 5 times greater than the wealth of the bottom half combined. And they conclude that until we address inequalities of power and political participation, progress on addressing economic inequality will be hindered. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation demonstrates that Scotland has simultaneously reached record levels of employment and record levels of in-work poverty at the same time in recent years, which taken together mean that we have not met the Sustainable Development Goal of decent work for all. The SDUC highlights some of the sectors where poverty pay holds workers back, particularly women, and calls for sectoral agreements to set minimum terms and conditions in social care and to promote collective bargaining in early learning and childcare. Disturbingly, in the context of a goal of inclusive and sustainable economic growth, it reports daily stories from young hospitality workers about bullying, harassment and unpaid wages, the kind of stories we would hope not to be hearing in the 2020s. So what is to be done? The editors of On Target for 2030 do not attempt to summarise the range of contributions, but they do draw some conclusions, which I hope the Minister will address in closing this debate. Among other things, they conclude that while there is clear policy and political commitment on all of the goals in Scotland, more needs to be done in order to meet the 2030 targets. There is a lack of available, high-quality, Scotland-specific data in some policy areas. And further work is needed to improve and build upon the existing fairly loose alignment between the outcomes and indicators in the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. In briefing members in advance of today's debate, the SDG Network Scotland built further on these conclusions with specific asks for both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. The network supports the approach of the Scottish Government in carrying out a supplementary review to support the report by the UK as member state to the United Nations. It supports that. They say that this supplementary review was prepared on a transparent, collaborative and innovative basis and provides a model the UK Government would do well to follow. It is, however, available thus far only online in draft form, and the network is very keen to see that review concluded and published in its final form as soon as possible. And I hope the Minister can give that undertaking today. And finally, Presiding Officer, the SDG network also calls on us as a Parliament to align our own remits more closely with the Sustainable Development Goals, with regular debates in future to hold Government to account on progress made. As members of this Parliament consider what priorities we may wish to suggest for members in the next session, this might be the right time to highlight the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as a proper focus for the 2020s. Thank you very much.
We'll move on to the open debate and speeches of no more than 4 minutes, please. Stuart Stevenson, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Presiding Officer, let me start by thanking Lewis MacDonald for the opportunity to discuss this really very substantial report, 82 pages, contributions from I think they're probably essays from 17 different contributors, and a rough count suggests over 200 references which lead you to further reading. So it isn't just what's in front of us, but what underpins it that helps us have a proper discussion about whether we're on target to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Looking first, perhaps, at homelessness, we all see in our walk to Parliament and elsewhere the visible evidence of homelessness, and I'm sure many of us will have talked to people we see in the streets. Every 18 minutes, someone in Scotland becomes homeless. That's about the time it takes on a bus down to Parliament from the centre of town. We have a target, of course, under the Scottish Government, under the Sustainable Development Goals, to get to zero poverty by 2030. That includes zero hunger, it includes getting good health and well-being. First Minister has adopted that in 2015 to reduce inequality across the globe, but inequality continues to exist in Scotland as it does in elsewhere. There are people, as Lewis MacDonald referred to, who are food insecure. 25% of our children live in poverty, and figures might suggest that that will rise if we don't see some amelioration and response to the position of financial constraints and austerity by Westminster. Too many people are relying on food banks, and nutritious food is yet to be accessible and affordable for all. It's one of the things my wife in particular always thinks about at Christmas. It's actually at the top of her shopping list. What's she going to go and buy to take to the food bank. I hope others do the same, but it is disappointing that we have to do so. Now that leads us to the broader question of socio-economic disadvantage and marginalisation. That exists in the wealthy northeast of Scotland, as it does in other parts of our country. That inequality relates to discrimination against women and girls, too much unhealthy eating. So are we on target to meet our goals? Yes, we're making progress on a number of targets, in particular water and sanitation, energy share for renewables, forest management, because this is an all-encompassing agenda. Eradication of poverty, steps towards phasing out food banks, have been made along with the creation of the Scottish Welfare Fund, which provides cash grants. That is an assistance to those in need. There are tools that we can use. The report from the joint work by the University of West of Scotland and the Oxfam Partnership and the SDG Scotland Network shows that there's progress. We're some distance away from 2030, but the reality is, and I think as one gets older and time seems to speed up, 2030 is almost tomorrow in planning terms and in policy terms. So I'm pleased to see businesses, individuals, civil society standing beside this effort. We're making progress on perhaps only a minority of the indicators in the national framework that relate to this, but progress we are making. We need a coherent approach to this. I think the proposal that I heard Lewis MacDonald just make about aligning Parliament's activities more closely with this is not one I'd heard made before, but I think is a very interesting one. Let me just close by congratulating all who've been involved in this report and hoping we hear some interesting things from the Minister.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate Lewis MacDonald on bringing this debate to the Chamber? And can I also just say a few words about the significance of the Sustainable Development Goals? These are important aspirations agreed across each of the 193 countries participating in the United Nations. They follow on and build on the previous work of the Millennium Development Goals, crafted at a decisive point in our history, reflecting the world's shared hope that a better, fairer planet can be created. These are common goals shared around the world. Some start from a lower base than others, some in very different circumstances from us, as I'll touch on later. But that united effort should drive us here and drive us locally. This is not to argue that the goals are beyond criticism. We can see that there will sometimes be practical trade-offs between objectives, that we'll have to make sensible judgments. They have been seen by some as being more diffuse than the Millennium Development Goals that preceded them. As aspirations, however, they point us forward in a positive direction. Contained within Lewis MacDonald's motion is a particular reference to his region, the North East. We should consider that while we debate this issue here, progress will be made in hundreds of small ways in communities across the globe. Indeed, many assessments recognise that the policy commitment here in Scotland to the SDGs is strong. But ultimately, it will be what happens on the ground and the positive impact that it makes to lives and communities that will be measured. So it's certainly worth reflecting on the local angle to building progress towards common objectives and some of the contrasts that can exist. In my own region, the Highlands and Islands, it's quite different from much of the rest of Scotland. We can look with some pride on the contribution that we're making there, but also recognise the difficulties. Goal 7, for example, highlights the importance of affordable, sustainable and modern energy for all. Looking around my region, I can see projects like EMEC, the European Marine Energy Centre in Orkney, making a global impact, driving forward progress that can provide benefits not only locally, but across the world. And there are many other examples of technology driving forward progress. But on the other hand, we still have a high concentration of homes in energy poverty, often off-grid and without financially viable alternatives to unsustainable oil heating. When we consider approaches to renewable heat, it's vital we take into account the many communities that are still left behind. Some of these differences are now enshrined in law, and I'm thinking, of course, of the Islands Act as one example. But as we enter the 2020s, it's clear that for real progress to be made, there must be a change in pace. At the General Assembly summit last year, the state parties committed to gearing up for a decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. There is little doubt that acceleration of these actions is on the table for the decade ahead and will be necessary if ambitious progress is to be made. In the Highlands and Islands, we are used to delay. We're used to being at the back of the queue for development. But to make sustainable development meaningful, development must occur. We can look around the world for great examples of societies that have made rapid progress in recent years. Often we've played a hand in that. The UK's international development work is a huge credit to this country, often working in difficult circumstances, areas recovering from conflict, underdeveloped rural communities, and in places hard to reach. The UK has worked with international partners to build on development goals around the world. That too should drive us on to make sustainable development a priority at home too. Scotland does not have these disadvantages, and the Highlands and Islands do not either. But too often, instead of development, we've seen decay, decline of public services, and an inability for government to adapt quickly to the changing needs of people. Sustainable development is about looking forward to the future, but that cannot happen without real development in our communities now.
Claudia Beamish, followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And thanks must, of course, go to Lewis MacDonald for initiating this important debate. The strong interest and wide range of valuable briefings is testament to the significance of the Sustainable Development Goals in and for Scotland. In its briefing, Scottish Wildlife Trust has stressed that, I quote, Agenda 30 was designed to be interconnected, but the current approach is fractured. The Sustainable Development Goals and our own National Performance Framework are, of course, our compass, both moral and directional, to tackling extreme poverty, inequalities, combating climate change, and so much more. None of these aims can be achieved in isolation. I suspect that all political parties, governments, and indeed civil servants, find the apparent simplicity of working in portfolio silos still hard to break down sometimes, but we do this today at our peril. The 13th of the SDGs is on climate action, and in my mind relevant to the achievement of all the other goals. This section has been authored by Stop Climate Chaos, whose collective work I want to recognise in coalescing parliamentarians and others around this action in the climate emergency. Yesterday's World Economic Forum risks report reinforced the grave concerns, which I don't need to highlight for this chamber and across Scotland today. However, action on climate change is needed very urgently, and I stress, if it is delivered without justice, it is simply a Pyrrhic victory. The Scottish Government should be disappointed that Oxfam and the West of Scotland's university's report finds its current commitments, I quote, do not stack up to the levels of urgent action we need. This is challenging for us all. The next decade leading to 2030 is crucial, and I'm proud that Scottish Labour's amendment for a steeper interim target was passed in the Climate Change Act. And it is right that the Scottish Government accepted the Labour amendments added to require consideration and reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals and the impact on the Global South into legislation here in Scotland. We must all together work to shaping the new updated climate change plan, and just transition on agriculture, land use, nature-based solutions, transport and energy efficiency are in all our interests. Action 13 concludes by proposing, I quote, that Scotland could pioneer parliamentary and policy mechanisms which ensure policy coherence and which scrutinise policies that contradict domestic and international climate policies. We can do this together. The Scottish Government is making a start, as is the Eclair Committee, and we need to work together on this. And at with COP26 here in Scotland, we have the chance to be inspirational leaders in contributing to tackling climate change in a fair way here, but this cannot be done without policy and action. Ambition is not enough. And finally, perhaps the most complex and challenging SDG to tackle through collective action is Action 14, Life Below Water. As we move into the year of coasts and waters, parallel with significance of showcasing, which is important, we must take the opportunity to scrutinise this SDG and ensure that our policies and actions always take it into account. We can also be leaders here, recognising that actions need to go also to enhancing our marine environment as committed to in our Marine Act of 2010. The report states that I quote, the restoration of blue carbon stores can contribute towards mitigating and adapting to climate change by making our oceans more resilient to change. And more broadly and importantly, without a step change in approach, we risk losing not only iconic nature, but also the ecosystem services that a healthy marine environment provides for people, including food, energy, recreation, and a sense of well-being. The interconnection with other SDGs is in sharp focus here, as it is with all of them, and has a clear global resonance as well as a Scottish resonance. So finally, the agenda declared, I quote, the Sustainable Development Goals and targets are integrated and indivisible. We need to take account of this as we move forward towards 2030 and beyond. Thank you.
Patrick Harvey, followed by Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I also thank Lewis MacDonald for bringing the motion and the debate to the Chamber. The SDGs, I think, have changed the relationship between international development and domestic policy. They are in many ways a recognition that we need a coherent, integrated approach. Rather than seeing these as separate spheres of policy, they have to be coherent. I wanted to reflect, therefore, in the beginning of this speech about the way in which international development has changed its position in this Parliament. When I was first elected, I used to work in sexual health, and I fell into conversation with Susan Deakin, who had established as Health Minister the first sexual health strategy. We were concerned that it was gathering dust on the shelf, that it wasn't going to be implemented properly, and we set up a CPG on sexual health. We thought it was going to have an overwhelmingly domestic focus. Very quickly, we were invited to take part in first European and then global discussions with other parliamentarians working on the same agenda at a domestic and global level, because recognition that sexual and reproductive health and rights are indivisible, the values that drive our progress on the domestic aspect of those issues, whether they're in relation to HIV or maternal health or any of the rest of it, are also the values that drive us to take action on the global stage to achieve many of the same objectives in international development. So this interconnection between domestic and international policy is one of the things that I think has developed hugely over the years, and the SDGs in many ways are a global recognition of this. The kind of issues that I think MSPs will want to talk about cover many of the themes that people have touched on already. I'll soon be issuing an invitation to MSPs to take part in an event here in Parliament led by young people who've been involved in a work with Project Scotland, looking at what they consider the most important aspect of the SDGs and how they relate to their own lives here living in Scotland, as well as the issues that need to be taken on globally. And if members decide to come along on the 25th of February, I'll plug it now, to the event that those young people will be leading that discussion here in Parliament. They'll hear about the emphasis on education, SDG 4, the need for financial education for young people in Scotland. They are recognising that this is something that isn't being done adequately yet in Scotland, that we need to do better to ensure that young people growing up in Scotland, who very often will face much more severe financial pressures than previous generations did, need to be equipped with the skills. They're going to focus on SDG 13, on climate action as well. And it's interesting to reflect on a day when we know that Extinction Rebellion activists are taking their demand for urgent change to Shell and to the climate criminals of the global fossil fuel industry, who have a long-standing track record of blocking the action that's needed on climate change. The young people in February will be talking about the importance of divestment from the fossil fuel industry, the need to break our reliance. And they're also going to talk about SDG 5 on gender equality. In particular, they're keen to raise issues in relation to the experience of young trans people in Scotland, because just like we heard from the First Minister during FMQs, there is a real need to recognise that feminism and the advancement of women's rights and the wider gender equality agenda is not just compatible with, but is necessarily linked to trans people's human rights as well. Whether everybody in this Parliament gets that yet or not remains to be seen, but I think overwhelmingly the younger generation do get that and want that argument to be heard. So I'll close at that, Presiding Officer, and just once more encourage members to keep an eye on their inbox for that invitation to the event on the 25th of February and hear what young people in Scotland have to say about the SDGs.
Bill Kidd, followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I shall help. Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would like to begin also by thanking and extending my thanks to Lewis MacDonald for bringing discussion of progress of these important global goals to this chamber, and to Oxfam for their collaborative approach to assessing SDGs and the insightful snapshot report. It's clear from the high level of engagement from a broad stroke of Scottish civil society in the SDGs and this review process that the global goals are useful and relevant to our country, and the SDGs are a tool for galvanising efforts in reducing poverty and creating a more peaceful and just society here in Scotland. Whilst this Parliament is not yet able to legislate in all areas relating to the SDGs, the consultancy work of Dr Graham Long shows that acts like the 2017 Child Poverty Act and the 2015 Community Empowerment Act, amongst others, take action to bridge the gap in legislative power. And consequently, these acts and Scottish Government policies and initiatives bring us closer towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and examples range from Scottish Government campaigns to maximise benefit take-up to the provision of free school meals. Now, the goals are by definition ambitious. How do we go about by achieving these, particularly when some issues can seem intractable or require complex solutions alongside the investment of substantial sums of money to projects and people? Whilst we will never be able to fully eradicate inequality in all its forms, it is our collective imperative to address injustices to the best of our ability, with our attention going towards those who are most disadvantaged, such as those living in poverty. This equitable effort defines the global goals. My colleagues here in the Chamber will know that I am an advocate for nuclear disarmament, and my reason for this is the inhumanity of nuclear weapons. Last October, I spoke at the UN in New York to support a campaign called Move the Money, where we used the SDGs as a point of accountability for the money wasted annually on nuclear weapons across the world. Over $100 billion are spent every year on the maintenance and development of nuclear weapons globally. As an exercise to illustrate how much money is wasted, we asked people in the streets to count out mock $1-million notes and place them into baskets representing each of the 17 SDGs. After a week's worth of counting, we managed to redistribute $542 billion to the 17 goals. $542 billion is the approximate amount of money that will be spent on nuclear weapons from 2020 to 2025. Whilst money cannot solve everything, I know that $542 billion being spent on tackling poverty, the climate, protecting women and girls from violence would go a long way towards achieving those goals. We might at times feel overwhelmed by the task of ending poverty and hunger and the many other issues covered by the global goals. However, by recognising how much money is spent every year without real question on weapons that have not been used since 1945, thankfully, we should acknowledge that moving substantially closer to achieving the SDGs is as much a matter of priority as it is of challenge. When it came to my turn to allocate $1-million notes to the SDGs, I chose to put my lot into no poverty, climate action and peace. And I would like to end by asking my colleagues to consider which goals they would personally prioritise and whether this would be a better way to spend $100 billion a year rather than pouring it into weapons of mass destruction. Once again, I would like to thank Oxfam and the many organisations in Scotland for their continued work towards achieving the SDGs, and may these next 10 years see real and substantial change. Thank you very much.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I congratulate Lewis MacDonald on bringing this important debate to the Chamber on the Target for 2030 report, analysing Scotland's progress against each of the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to focus my remarks on the progress we're making towards achieving gender equality and on health inequalities. On SDG 5, which Patrick Harvey mentioned, I think we can agree we are making positive progress towards gender equality, but there's much more that we still have to do. The Domestic Abuse Bill is a good example, as is legislation to secure gender equal representation on public boards, but we cannot be complacent. I note there's a commitment to better recording of hidden sexual harassment within schools, but we do need to go further, and I agree with Girl Guiding Scotland and others that we need to see national guidance for our schools so that we can really have a zero tolerance approach to sexual harassment. The Public Boards Bill has been a step in the right direction, but I think we all want to see us go further in terms of positive measures to increase women's representation and participation in political, economic and public life. And the work of Women 50-50, for example, has really pushed political parties. Some have been easier to push than others, but we need to start seeing 50-50 representation on candidate lists from all the parties. And Lewis MacDonald talked about some of the challenging questions that we need to address. I'm pleased that Patrick Harvey has spoken passionately about gender equality. This Parliament, for example, has the power to decriminalise abortion. But I'm not sure the Parliament is ready to have that conversation, or we have a majority. These are if we want to lead the world, we're already behind some of the rest of the world on that issue, but these are the issues that we have to face up to. And in terms of access to sexual and reproductive health care now, this Scottish Government and health boards across Scotland are allowing very long waiting lists to exist, and women are struggling to access contraception and other health services. That's not good enough. It will be no surprise that I want to talk about periods and access to period products. And it's more than just about access to products, it's about period dignity and equality for everyone who menstruates. My Members Bill, which is another plug, but I'm not embarrassed to say, but we're at stage 1 of that process, and I would really urge all members to listen to Civic Scotland, to listen to the wide support that exists, and to allow that bill to advance beyond stage 1 so we can look to improve it together. Because if we want to take bold, ambitious action, this is a perfect example of world-leading legislation. And whilst I welcome initiatives taken by the Scottish Government and others in the public sector to tackle period poverty in a targeted way, my argument is we need a universal approach, a universal scheme that would leave no one behind. And I was delighted that the Scottish Women's Convention, Engender, the Young Women's Movement and many others have agreed on that approach. Girl Guiding Scotland have given us a really helpful briefing, and I want to congratulate them on the work that they have done on period equality. They've created an End Period Poverty badge, which is fantastic. And in my region, First Stonehouse Rangers completed the badge, and they've been placing donations of period products in South Lanarkshire's Women's Aid and beyond. There's really good work happening, but as Alliance have told us in their briefing, health inequalities is a serious issue, and in terms of life expectancy, we can't continue to have people in Scotland who live in the poorest areas expecting to have 20 years less on this planet than those living in the most affluent parts of Scotland. So I agree with others, we need to be bold, we need to be ambitious, there's no room for complacency. We can pat ourselves on the back on some things, but we all have to do better collectively.
Now call Kate Forbes to respond to the debate for around 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you also to Lewis MacDonald for securing this important debate. And I think thanks also to the report authors, Oxfam Scotland, University of the West of Scotland and the SDGs Network Scotland and multiple contributors. I know that there's a lot of stakeholders in the gallery, and certainly from the Scottish Government's perspective, we enormously value the work that stakeholders do in this area. Now, contrary to Claudia Beamish's view that we were disappointed with the report, actually, it was enormously welcome. This publication of the On Target for 2030 report was really helpful because, as the report illustrates, we've been engaging widely with civic society and taking forward the important agenda around the SDGs, including as an active member of Scotland's Sustainable Development Goals network. But evaluation is fundamentally important. And if we are to ensure we meet our targets for 2030, then I think it's important that we don't just internally consider what we're doing, but we have that international analysis as well in terms of progress to date. In 2015, Scotland became one of the first nations to sign up to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And that demonstrates our commitment to playing our part in achieving goals both here in Scotland as well as our contribution globally. And Patrick Harvey's already mentioned the way in which the relationship between the international development element of this and domestic policy has changed over the years, and we're very mindful that there's means by which we can mutually benefit in learning from other countries. The UN Sustainable Development Goals offers a vision of the world. Jimmy Halcrow-Johnson talked about the need for aspiration and ambition, and it is that, from ending poverty and hunger to securing education and health services to combating inequality and achieving gender equality. These aims set an agenda for tackling some of the world's greatest problems. And here in Scotland, we want to be pioneering outcomes. We want to be pioneering results and means by which we can meet those goals, which then might be valuable to the rest of the world. And in signing up, the Scottish Government is required to demonstrate how we will work to achieve those targets by 2030. Many of the goals already align with what we're doing to tackle poverty and inequality, not just here at home, but globally too. But the question for all of us is how we actually achieve that. And our internationally recognised National Performance Framework is the main vehicle by which to deliver and localise the SDGs. Now, Claudia Beamish rightly mentioned the importance of not working in silos, and the National Performance Framework brings it all together to ensure that there is that connectedness between different teams doing different things to achieve different goals. And the National Performance Framework is essentially Scotland's wellbeing framework. It shares the same aspiration for social, environmental and economic improvements to define a country's success as being more than just growth in GDP. And the NPF is not just the government's framework either. It belongs to the whole of Scotland. One of the most important lines, I think, certainly in the motion, is the last line, which is a rallying call to all of Scotland to recognise the role that we all play in embedding the Sustainable Development Goals and reaching them in the work that we do. And the National Performance Framework fundamentally reflects that partnership principle which underpins the UN 2030 agenda. It enables us to mobilise partners, stakeholders and others on those outcomes so that they can join in with meeting the SDGs. Now, as all of the reports recognise, there's been some good progress since adopting the SDGs, including our commitment to tackle child poverty and health inequality. But there's no question that there remains work for us to do to meet the 2030 target. And as Bill Kidd said, a lot of this comes down to prioritisation. We're committed to the SDGs by creating a more successful country with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish in every region with every background through increased well-being and sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Now, Stuart Stevenson mentioned child poverty, and if I take that as an example, in recent years, the Scottish Government has passed legislation with the Child Poverty Act in 2017. We've published the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. We've implemented through the new Scottish Social Security System the Best Start grants for low-income parents, and will soon start the new Scottish Child Payments. And this is a programme of work that we should be proud of, but we should also recognise what we're trying to achieve through it, which is to deliver on our commitments to tackle poverty, which I believe will serve us well in meeting those goals. That programme of legislation takes us closer to achieving goals which are ambitious but fundamentally and morally important. So we'll continue to take the necessary action to ensure that no one is left behind, and that is at the heart of the NPF for an inclusive Scotland with the opportunity for all. Now, I think it's what's been refreshing in this debate, and Monica Lennon mentioned it, is the need to reflect on progress to date, which not necessarily patting ourselves on the back, but recognising the work that so many different parties and stakeholders are delivering, but also to recognise the scale of the challenge. These goals have got to fundamentally be ambitious and aspirational if we're going to deal with the inherent inequalities that still exist in this country. And to do that, we need all of Scotland to work together. Now, just before I close, Lewis MacDonald specifically asked me a question on the Scottish Supplementary Review, and it's worth reflecting just briefly on the background. So this came out of the fact that there were significant limitations, I think, with the UK government approach. So the Scottish Government's been working with stakeholders to collaboratively develop content for our own specific Scottish review. And there's fundamental differences, for example, between our two governments, the UK government and the Scottish government, in approaches to some key issues. For example, goal number 1 on no poverty is a particular challenge, given how strongly the Scottish Government feels about the UK Government's welfare reforms. But in working with the SDG Scotland network, we have been trying to assess performance and highlight the challenges and opportunities to realising the SDGs specifically in Scotland. Now, we're now in the last stage of finalising the Scottish Supplementary Review, and that will be published imminently and shortly, within hopefully before spring or by this spring. But as Lewis MacDonald mentioned, stakeholders are aware, and the draft report is available online on the SDG Network webpage. So as I close, Presiding Officer, I think fighting inequalities continues to be at the heart of the Scottish Government's vision for a fairer Scotland, and it's enormously valuable when reports like this highlight the work that's been done and the work that we've still to do to achieve that ambition.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes the debate, and the meeting is suspended until 2:30.